Late 1943. The Naval Intelligence Office in Kiel, Germany. The cigarette smoke hung thick in the windowless briefing room, catching the light from a single overhead lamp that illuminated a collection of reconnaissance photographs spread across the steel table. Fregattenkapitän Werner Hartmann had spent 23 years in the Kriegsmarine, had studied every major warship in the world's navies, could identify a vessel by its silhouette at 20,000 metres. But the photographs before him showed something that made his hands shake slightly as he reached for another cigarette. The images had arrived through circuitous routines, neutral observers in American ports, intelligence operatives in South America, intercepted technical documents. Each source told the same impossible story. The Americans had built something extraordinary. The USS Iowa, not just another battleship, something fundamentally different. 9 16-inch guns. That alone wasn't shocking. The British had mounted 15-inch weapons. The Japanese, intelligence suggested, had gone even larger. But it was the numbers scrawled in the margins by the analysis section that made Hartmann's mouth go dry. Shell weight, 2,700 pounds. His own ships, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, fired shells weighing 1,800 pounds. Range, over 40,000 yards. The Bismarck, may she rest in peace, had managed 36,000 on a good day. Then came the number that seemed like a typographical error. Armour penetration, 20 inches of Krupp cemented steel at 20,000 yards. 20 inches. Hartmann looked at the specification sheet for the Bismarck again, though he knew the numbers by heart. Main belt armour, 12.6 inches. The Americans had built a gun that could punch through Germany's finest battleship armour as if it were tin sheeting. He stubbed out his cigarette and lit another. Around him, younger officers studied the photographs with the careful neutrality of men who understood the implications but didn't want to voice them, because saying it out loud would make it real. The Americans hadn't just built a bigger battleship, they had changed the rules of naval warfare. And Germany's surface fleet, what little remained after 3 years of war, had become obsolete overnight. Hartmann picked up his pen and began writing his assessment, knowing that every word would be read by Grand Admiral Dönitz himself. He chose his language carefully, but there was no diplomatic way to deliver the truth. If these specifications were accurate, and every instinct told him they were, then no German capital ship could survive an engagement with an Iowa-class battleship. The Americans had won a race Germany hadn't even known it was running. Brooklyn Navy Yard, New York, March 1940. The sound of 10,000 riveting hammers created a symphony of industrial violence that could be heard for miles. Inside the massive construction shed, the keel of what would become the USS Iowa stretched nearly 700 feet, a steel spine that would support the most powerful warship ever built in an American yard. John Thompson had worked at the Navy Yard for 18 years, had helped build cruisers and destroyers, but nothing prepared him for the scale of what was rising from the blocks before him. The design had emerged from 18 months of intense work by the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair. The challenge had been clear, but seemed impossible. Build a battleship capable of defeating any ship afloat while maintaining 33 knots, fast enough to escort the new Essex-class carriers. Speed and armour were enemies in naval architecture. You could have one or the other, but both required genius. Or, as it turned out, brute force engineering, backed by American industrial capacity that had no rival on Earth. The solution was the Mark 7 16-inch 50 caliber naval rifle. Thompson watched as the first gun barrel arrived by rail, a 66-foot steel tube weighing 134 tons. It took 2 days just to move it from the flat car to the assembly area. The barrel wasn't a single piece of steel. It was a miracle of metallurgy. Multiple layers of different steel alloys, each one heat-treated to specific properties, then shrunk together under hydraulic pressure that exceeded anything used in peacetime industry. The result was a tube capable of withstanding pressures that would vaporize ordinary steel, but the gun was only half the story. In a warehouse across the yard, Thompson's brother-in-law worked in the shell fabrication facility. Each armour-piercing projectile took 6 months to manufacture, 6 months for a single shell. The process involved 17 separate machining operations, each one held to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The steel came from a special alloy developed by Bethlehem Steel, forged in furnaces that burned at temperatures hot enough to melt platinum. The nose was hardened until it could scratch diamond. The body was heat-treated in sections, harder at the front, slightly softer toward the base, creating a projectile that could punch through 2 feet of armour plate without shattering. Thompson stood in the shadow of Turret 2, one afternoon in late 1942, watching as the guns were installed. Each turret weighed as much as a destroyer. The machinery inside was so complex it required a crew of 63 men to operate: ammunition hoists, powder handling rooms, hydraulic rammers powerful enough to drive a 1-ton shell into a gun chamber in less than 3 seconds. He tried to imagine what it would be like to fire these weapons in anger. The thought made him grateful he'd be staying in Brooklyn. Some young sailor would have that particular nightmare. Thompson would just build the thing and send it off to war with a prayer. Naval Proving Ground, Dahlgren, Virginia. January 1941. Dr. Robert Kent had spent his entire career studying terminal ballistics, the science of what happens when projectiles strike armour. He had calculated trajectory tables for a dozen different naval rifles, had witnessed test firings of every major weapon in the American arsenal. But standing in the observation bunker that morning, watching the range crew prepare the first full-pressure test firing of the 16-inch Mark 7, he felt something he hadn't experienced since graduate school: genuine uncertainty about what was going to happen. The numbers on paper were extraordinary. When fired at maximum charge, the Mark 8 armour-piercing shell would leave the muzzle at 2,600 feet per second. To achieve that velocity, the propellant charge weighed 660 pounds, packed into 6 silk bags designed to burn in a precisely controlled sequence. The pressure inside the gun barrel would reach 43,000 pounds per square inch. Kent had done the calculations a dozen times. The gun should hold, but should and would were different concepts when you were dealing with forces that could tear steel apart like tissue paper. The test target sat 5 miles downrange, a massive steel assembly that had taken 3 months to construct. The centre section was genuine German Krupp cemented armour, 12 inches thick, captured from a partially completed battleship in a French yard in 1918. Behind it, structural steel and instruments that would measure everything about the impact: velocity, angle, penetration depth, deformation. If the shell performed as designed, the armour plate wouldn't have a chance. The warning klaxon echoed across the range. Kent pulled on hearing protection, but he knew it wouldn't help much. The observation bunker was half a mile from the gun, with 3 feet of reinforced concrete between him and the blast. It still felt too close. Then the world exploded. The sound wasn't something you heard, it was something you felt in your bones, in your teeth, in your organs. The shockwave hit the bunker like a physical blow. Through the armoured glass slit, Kent saw the muzzle flash, a tongue of superheated gas extending over 100 feet, bright enough to leave after images when he blinked. 5 miles away, the Krupp armour plate ceased to exist. The shell hit with the force of a meteor strike. The hardened nose punched through 12 inches of the finest armour steel Germany had ever produced, barely slowing. Behind the armour, in the backing structure, the 40-pound explosive charge detonated. Steel fragments weighing hundreds of pounds were thrown a quarter mile. The instruments in the protected observation post recorded everything: penetration angle, deformation characteristics, time from impact to detonation. Every measurement confirmed what Kent had calculated. At 5 miles, with a relatively flat trajectory, the shell had performed perfectly. At longer ranges, with steeper impact angles, it would perform even better. Kent wrote his report that evening in his quarters, choosing his words carefully. The 16-inch Mark 7 firing the Mark 8 armour-piercing shell was the most powerful naval weapon system in the world. No ship afloat could survive it. He signed the report and sent it up the chain. Somewhere in the Pacific or the Atlantic, enemy sailors would discover the truth the hard way. Oberursel, Interrogation Centre, Germany, June 1943. The British and American intelligence officers had been questioning Kapitän zur See Friedrich Weber for 3 days. Weber had commanded the battleship Scharnhorst's gunnery division before his capture in North Africa, where he'd been serving as a liaison officer. He was cooperative, even friendly. understanding that the war was essentially lost and seeing no point in protecting technical secrets that wouldn't change the outcome. But when they showed him the metallurgical analysis of a captured American armour-piercing shell fragment, his face went pale. "This is not possible," he said in excellent English, studying the cross-section photographs. "This is not how shells are made." The American officer, a metallurgist from MIT, now wearing an army uniform, smiled slightly. "Why don't you tell us how shells are made, Capitan?" Weber lit a cigarette with fingers that trembled slightly. He'd spent 5 years at the Krupp works in Essen before the war, had watched the manufacture of armour-piercing shells for the Kriegsmarine's capital ships. German shells were masterpieces of engineering, forged from the finest steel, heat-treated to precise specifications, hardened until they could punch through the best armour in the world. But the American shell was different. "You have heat-treated the nose separately from the body," Weber said, pointing to the analysis, "and the body is treated in sections, harder here, at the penetrating cap, softer here, at the base. This requires, I don't know how many separate heat treatments, 4, 5, 7, the American officer said. Each section of the shell is treated individually, then the entire assembly is treated again, takes 6 months per shell." Weber did the mathematics in his head. 6 months. The Americans had dozens of battleships, cruisers mounting these 16-inch guns, thousands of shells. The industrial capacity required was beyond anything Germany could match. "Your armour-piercing shells weigh 1,800 pounds, the American said. "Ours weigh 2,700. But it's not the weight that matters, is it?" Weber shook his head slowly. Weight helped, but the real secret was the nose design. American shells used a penetrating cap made from steel, harder than anything Krupp had achieved. When the shell hit armour, that cap would punch through without shattering. Behind it, a softer cap would cushion the main shell body during the violent deceleration of penetration. The shell body itself would remain intact all the way through even the thickest armour, detonating inside the ship where it would do maximum damage. He stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. "How thick can your shells penetrate?" The American officer consulted his notes. "Against Krupp, cemented armour. At 20,000 yards, penetration is 20 inches. Against face-hardened armour, slightly more. 20 inches. The Bismarck's belt armour was 12.6 inches. The Tirpitz, Germany's most powerful remaining capital ship, had similar protection. Neither could survive." Weber said it out loud because someone had to. "Our battleships are obsolete." The American nodded. "Yes, but don't feel bad. So are the British ones, the Italian ones, the Japanese ones. We just decided to build something that made everything else obsolete, including our own older battleships." That night, in his cell, Weber wrote a letter to his wife in Bremen. He couldn't tell her the details, couldn't reveal what he'd learned, but he could tell her the truth that mattered. The Americans have won. Not just the battles. They've won the entire concept of naval warfare. Our ships are like cavalry facing machine guns. Brave, perhaps, but dead. Chesapeake Bay, Maryland. March 3rd, 1943. Seaman First Class. James Mitchell stood on the main deck of the USS Iowa, his hands gripping the rail hard enough to hurt. This was his first time aboard a battleship, his first time experiencing what the Navy called a full-caliber firing exercise. The old salts who'd served on older battle wagons told stories about the blast, about the noise, about the shock. Mitchell had thought they were exaggerating. Sailors always exaggerated. The target barge sat 5 miles away, barely visible even with binoculars. It was loaded with steel plate assemblies, armour samples, monitoring equipment. Behind it, 2 miles further, a camera platform would record everything at 1,000 frames per second. The crews had spent a week preparing for this moment. Now it was time to discover if the Iowa's guns were everything the designers promised. The loudspeaker crackled to life. "All hands, stand clear of turret 2, preparing to fire 1 gun. I say again, 1 gun." Mitchell moved to the designated safe zone, but he could still see the massive turret rotating slightly, the gun barrel elevating to the precise angle calculated by the fire control computers deep in the ship's bowels. 3 decks below, in the turret machinery spaces, 63 men worked in orchestrated chaos. The shell, 2,700 pounds of steel and explosive, rode up on the ammunition hoist. The powder bags followed, 6 silk containers holding enough propellant to launch a small car into orbit. The loading crew worked with the precision of a Swiss watch, shell into the chamber. Powder bags rammed home. Breech closed. The gun captain reported ready. On the bridge, Captain John McCrayer looked at his gunnery officer. Fire when ready. The waiting stretched. Mitchell could hear his own breathing, could feel his heart pounding. Then turret 2 fired. The world ended, not figuratively. For one eternal instant, James Mitchell was certain he had died. The blast pressure hit him like a fist, drove the air from his lungs, made his vision blur. The sound was beyond description, not heard, but felt. A physical presence that penetrated his body and shook his organs. His knees buckled. He grabbed the rail to keep from falling. 5 miles away, the target barge simply ceased to exist. The shell arrived before the sound of the gun firing could reach it. One moment, a barge floating peacefully. The next, an explosion that threw steel fragments in every direction. The 12-inch armour plate, the same specification as the Bismarck's main belt, had a neat round hole punched completely through it. The edges of the hole glowed red-hot from the friction of penetration. Behind the armour, the backing structure was shredded. The cameras captured it all. The shell maintaining perfect stability throughout penetration, the explosive charge detonating with surgical precision. The complete and total destruction of a target designed to simulate the most heavily armoured warship in existence. Mitchell straightened up, his ears ringing, his hands still shaking. Around him, other sailors were picking themselves up, checking for damage, looking at each other with expressions that mixed shock and awe. An old petty officer, who'd served on the Pennsylvania before transferring to Iowa, walked past shaking his head. "And that's just one gun," he said to no one in particular. "We got 9 of those bastards." That night, in his bunk, Mitchell wrote a letter to his kid brother back in Ohio. "I can't tell you much about what we're doing," he wrote, "but I can tell you this. Whatever the enemy has, whatever they think they've got, it won't be enough. Not even close." Oberkommando der Kriegsmarine, Berlin, February 1944. Konteradmiral Erich Förster laid the intelligence summary on Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz's desk with the careful precision of a man handling a live bomb. Dönitz looked up from the convoy routing charts that covered most of his desk, his face showing the exhaustion of a man trying to fight a war with forces that diminished daily. "The American battleships?" he asked. Förster nodded. The report was 70 pages of technical analysis, combat observations, and strategic assessment. But the summary could be delivered in a single paragraph, which Förster had memorized during the sleepless night after he'd finished reading it. 4 Iowa-class battleships are now operational in the Pacific: Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin. 2 more are under construction and will be completed by year's end. Each mounts 9 16-inch guns. Combined effective firepower exceeds the entire remaining German surface fleet. Dönitz lit a cigarette. Their capabilities? "The intelligence is comprehensive, Herr Gross-Admiral. We have observations from neutral observers in American ports, intercepted technical documents. Most recently, testimony from a U-boat commander who observed the New Jersey conducting gunnery exercises off Brazil before being interned." First I opened the report to a marked page. The firing rate is approximately 1 salvo every 45 seconds, all 9 guns. The shells weigh 2,700 pounds. The maximum effective range exceeds 40,000 yards. Dönitz did the mathematics quickly. German 15-inch guns had a maximum range of 36,000 yards and fired shells of 1,800 pounds, faster rate of fire, longer range, heavier shells. The Americans had advantages in every category. "Armour penetration?" Dönitz asked, though his tone suggested he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "At 20,000 yards, the American shells can penetrate 20 inches of Krupp cemented armour. The Bismarck's main belt was 12.6 inches. Tirpitz has similar protection." The Admiral stubbed out his cigarette halfway through and immediately lit another. "So neither ship could survive an engagement." "No, Herr Gross-Admiral." The silence stretched. Outside the window, Berlin was experiencing one of its increasingly frequent air raid alerts. The wail of sirens provided an appropriate soundtrack. "There's more," Förster said quietly. "The Americans have also achieved superior speed. The Iowa class can make 33 knots. The Tirpitz manages 29 at best. The Americans can choose when to engage and when to disengage. We cannot force battle. We cannot flee. We can only die well." Dunitz stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city his navy had failed to defend, failed to protect the shipping that might have kept fed, failed to prevent the invasion building in England, failed at everything except dying bravely, which was the most useless kind of success. "Draft an order," he said without turning around. "All capital ships are to avoid engagement with American Iowa-class battleships under any circumstances. If contact becomes unavoidable, maximum range is to be maintained while seeking opportunities for disengagement." Förster made notes. "Should I classify this at the highest level?" "Everyone knows already, Förster. The captains know their ships can't win. The crews know. The Americans certainly know. We're just making it official." He turned back to his desk. "Is there anything positive in that report? Anything at all?" Förster thought for a moment. "The Americans have not yet deployed Iowa-class battleships to the Atlantic. They remain in the Pacific theatre." "Small comfort," Dunitz said, "but I suppose we should be grateful. Write the order. And Förster? When you're done, burn that report. I don't want it sitting in files for future historians to laugh at." February 16th, 1944. 20 miles north of Truk Atoll, Caroline Islands. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hartley stood on the bridge of the USS Iowa, studying the horizon through his binoculars as dawn broke over the Pacific. Operation Hailstone was entering its second day. American carrier aircraft had been pounding the Japanese fortress since yesterday morning. Now Iowa and her sister ship New Jersey had been ordered to intercept any Japanese vessels attempting to escape the lagoon. At 07:45 hours, the fire control radar picked up a contact. Single vessel, moving fast. Range, 38,000 yards, over 21 miles. "Looks like a destroyer," the radar operator reported. "Making at least 33 knots, sir, heading 045. Captain John McCrayer studied the plot. A Japanese destroyer trying to make a run for open water. At that range, most battleships wouldn't even attempt engagement. The target would be well beyond effective range, moving at high speed and capable of radical course changes that would make accurate fire nearly impossible. But the Iowa wasn't most battleships. "Fire control, can you get a solution?" Commander Hartley worked with his team, feeding data into the Mark 38 gun director, wind speed and direction, air temperature and density, the target's speed and bearing, the Earth's rotation, even the temperature of the propellant charges, which would affect muzzle velocity. The computer, a mechanical marvel of gears and cams, processed it all in seconds. "Solution obtained, Captain. Recommend turrets 1 and 2, 6 guns, range 35700 yards." McCrayer nodded. "Batteries release. Fire when ready." In turrets 1 and 2, the gun crews had been at battle stations for 4 hours. They knew the drill. They'd practiced it 1,000 times. But this was different. This was real. The guns elevated to maximum angle, nearly 45 degrees. At that elevation, the shells would climb over 3 miles into the air before beginning their descent toward the target. The fire control officer checked his calculations one final time. "Salvo ready, sir." "Fire." The Iowa shuddered. 6 16-inch guns fired in a staggered ripple, each barrel erupting a half second after the previous one to avoid interference between the shells. 16 tons of steel and explosive climbed into the morning sky. Aboard the Japanese destroyer Nowaki, Commander Katsuji Takayanagi was focused on escape. His ship had been loading supplies for Rabaul when the American carrier aircraft struck yesterday. He'd managed to get underway during the night, hoping to reach open water before dawn. Now, with the sun rising, he'd been spotted. The radio operator reported 2 large ships to the south, battleships, American battleships. Takayanagi wasn't worried. The enemy ships were at least 40,000 meters distant, beyond the range of any battleship gun in the world. he ordered a slight course change just to be safe and increased speed to maximum. Then, with no warning, the ocean around Nowaki exploded. Massive columns of water erupted on both sides of the ship. The first shell landed 50 yards ahead, the second 20 yards astern. The third and fourth were direct hits. One shell struck the water immediately alongside the destroyer and detonated, the blast lifting the stern clear of the water. The other struck short and ricocheted, missing the ship by feet. 2 more shells landed close enough that fragments peppered the superstructure. Aboard the Iowa, the fire control team watched the splashes with professional satisfaction. "Straddle," the observer reported. 2 over, 2 short, 2 ricochets. At 35,700 yards. 20 miles and change. The longest range straddle in naval history. McCrae allowed himself a small smile. Reload. Prepare second salvo. But before the Iowa could fire again, Nowaki disappeared into a rain squall, her commander no doubt thanking every god he knew. The destroyer would escape, damaged but afloat, but the message had been sent. American battleships could reach out and touch you from distances that should have been safe. Below decks, Seaman Mitchell, the same sailor who'd experienced his first firing in Chesapeake Bay a year earlier, was part of the ammunition handling crew. He'd felt the ship fire, felt the recoil through his feet. Now he waited for orders to prepare the next salvo. The loudspeaker crackled. "Cease fire, target out of range." Mitchell looked at his loader crew chief, a grizzled petty officer who'd served on battleships for 15 years. "Did we get him?" The chief shook his head. "Don't matter. We just showed the Japanese Navy what the Iowa can do. That destroyer captain is going to tell everyone who'll listen, shot at from 20 miles away. By tomorrow, every Japanese sailor in the Pacific will know. They'll know there's nowhere we can't reach them. That's worth more than sinking one tin can." Sinking one tin. Turret 2, USS Iowa, April 1944. The battle station alarm had sounded at shh. By 0545, all 63 men assigned to Turret 2 were at their stations, sealed inside nearly 4,000 tons of steel and machinery. Gunner's Mate First Class Robert Mac Mackenzie had been in this space for 8 months now. He knew every inch of it, knew which hydraulic line leaked slightly when the temperature dropped, knew which ammunition hoist made a clicking sound every third revolution, knew the smell of it, oil, brass, sweat, and that peculiar metallic scent of confined steel spaces. Load 3 came the order from fire control. The command meant nothing to civilians. To Mac and his crew, it meant everything. They went into motion with choreographed precision. 3 decks below, in the magazines, men worked in spaces cooled to 55 degrees to prevent accidental detonation of the propellant. Each shell sat in its own cradle, carefully maintained, regularly inspected. A faulty shell could kill everyone in the turret and possibly split the entire ship in half. The magazine crew loaded a 2,700-pound shell onto the lower hoist. Electric motors, specially designed to prevent sparks, lifted the projectile through the handling room and into the turret gun room. Mac's station was at the ramming controls for the centre gun. He watched the shell arrive on the loading tray, the brass band around its base gleaming in the work lights, beautiful in its way. A masterpiece of engineering that existed for a single purpose: to punch through 2 feet of steel armour and explode inside an enemy ship. The gun elevated to loading angle with a smooth hydraulic whisper. The breech opened. Mac threw the ram control. The hydraulic piston extended with massive force, driving the shell into the chamber. 4 seconds. Next came the powder, 6 silk bags, each marked with its position in the loading sequence. Wrong order meant incomplete burn, which meant reduced velocity, which meant the shell would fall short of the target. Mac's crew handled the bags with religious reverence. "Gun loaded and ready," Mac reported. Similar reports came from left and right guns. "Turret ready," the turret captain reported to fire control. Then came the waiting, sometimes seconds, sometimes minutes. You learned not to think about what you were waiting for, not to imagine the enemy ship on the other end of the trajectory, not to think about the men inside that ship who were probably at their own battle stations, probably just as scared, probably hoping they'd make it through the next few minutes alive. Stand by. The warning gave them 1 second to brace. Fire. The gun fired. The world inside the turret became violence given form. The recoil system absorbed. 267 tons of metal moving backward at maximum speed. The hydraulic buffers compressed, their temperature jumping instantly as they converted kinetic energy into heat. The air inside the turret became a pressure wave that hit every man like a fist. Mac's teeth clacked together, his vision blurred, his ears would ring for hours. Then it was over. The gun returned to battery position. The breech opened automatically, venting hot gases that stank of burned propellant. The empty powder cases would be disposed of later. Now there was only the next shell. Reload, came the order, and they did, and fired again, and reloaded, and fired. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. They fired 9 salvos, 27 shells, 73,000 pounds of steel and explosive. Mac counted them in his head, a way to keep from thinking about the monotony, the fear, the exhaustion. After the ceasefire order, when the turret was secured and the hatches opened to the outside world, Mac climbed up to the main deck. His legs felt like rubber. His ears were still ringing despite the protection. His hands shook from adrenaline and fatigue. Another gunner, from turret 3, was already topside, smoking a cigarette with trembling hands. "You see what we hit?" he asked. Mac shook his head. "Don't matter," the other man said. "We fired. That's our job. We load, we fire, we reload. Someone else decides if it was worth it." But that night, in his bunk, Mac wrote in the journal he kept hidden under his mattress. "Fired 9 salvos today, 27 shells. Each one costs more than my dad made in 10 years. Each one can sink a ship, kill hundreds of men. I'm 22 years old and I've got more destructive power at my fingertips than Napoleon had in his entire army. Sometimes I wonder if that's something to be proud of, or something to be terrified by. Mostly I just try not to think about it. Do the job. Stay alive. Go home when this is over." Off Okinawa, March 24th, 1945. The Japanese had turned the island into a fortress. Months of Allied bombing had barely scratched the defences. Thousands of artillery pieces and mortars, dug into caves and reinforced bunkers, could rain fire on the beaches where American Marines would soon land. The invasion planners knew it would be bloody. Every yard of beach would cost lives, unless the big guns could soften the defences first. USS Wisconsin lay 3 miles offshore, close enough to see the cliffs, far enough to be outside the range of most enemy artillery. Fire Control had spent 2 days mapping targets using aerial reconnaissance photographs and reports from submarines that had surveyed the coastline at night. Now it was time to see if battleship firepower could break fortifications that bombers had failed to destroy. The primary target was a battery of Japanese 150mm guns positioned in caves on the northern cliff face. The position commanded the approach to Green Beach. As long as those guns remained operational, landing craft approaching the beach would be massacred. Commander David Wilson, Wisconsin's gunnery officer, studied the targeting solution. The range was 18,000 yards, just over 10 miles. The target was partially concealed in a cave mouth carved into solid rock. The Japanese had reinforced the position with concrete and steel. Intelligence estimated the overhead protection at 8 to 10 feet of rock and concrete. Any normal bombardment would accomplish nothing. The shells would detonate on the surface, making impressive fireballs and accomplishing exactly nothing. But the Mark 8 armour-piercing shell wasn't designed to detonate on contact. It was designed to penetrate first, then explode. "Turrets 1 and 2, Wilson ordered. "Semi-armour piercing, delayed fuse. Target is coordinates Whiskey 47, 6 guns, fire mission." In the turrets, the crews loaded not the standard armour-piercing shells, but a variant specifically designed for shore bombardment. Same weight, same penetrating cap, but with a delay fuse that would allow the shell to punch deep into the rock face before detonating. The guns elevated. The fire control solution incorporated the cliff angle, the rock hardness, everything the intelligence section could provide. Batteries released. The 6 guns fired in ripple sequence. The shells arced through the morning air, climbing 3 miles high before beginning their descent. From the cliff face, Japanese observers saw the American battleship flash and smoke. They had perhaps 12 seconds to take cover before the shells arrived. not nearly enough time. The first shell struck the cliff face 20 feet above the cave mouth. 1,600 pounds of steel, travelling at just under sonic speed, hit solid rock with the force of a meteor. The hardened nose punched through 6 feet of rock and concrete before the delayed fuse triggered. The explosion occurred inside the cliff. The rock face simply ceased to exist. Tons of stone were blown outward in an expanding cloud of fragments. The cave mouth collapsed. The Japanese guns inside were buried under hundreds of tons of rubble. The next 5 shells struck within 30 seconds, each one hammering the target area, each one penetrating, deep before exploding, each one doing the work of 100 conventional shells. When the dust cleared, the entire cliff face had changed shape. Where there had been fortified positions, there was now a raw wound in the rock. Below decks, pharmacist's mate second-class Thomas Bradley felt each salvo through the deck plates. He'd been aboard Wisconsin for 8 months, had treated injuries from everything from battle damage to routine accidents, but he'd never gotten used to the firing, the noise, the violence, the knowledge that each shell was designed to kill. He checked his medical supplies for the 100th time, making sure everything was ready if the Japanese returned fire, making sure he could save lives if the shells came back. The Japanese didn't return fire. They couldn't. Their guns were buried under a cliff that no longer existed. 2 days later, Marines landed on Green Beach under sporadic fire from positions further inland. But the battery that should have torn them apart was gone, destroyed by 6 shells from a battleship 10 miles away. Bradley watched the landing craft head toward shore from Wisconsin's main deck. Watched the Marines hit the beach. Watched them advance. Knowing that some of them owed their lives to the shells his ship had fired. Knowing that others would die anyway, because war was like that. You could save some, never all. Naval Historical Center, Washington, D.C., June 1946. The war was over. The analyses could begin. Commander Richard Thompson, formerly of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, now working as a civilian contractor, spread the combat reports across the conference table. 18 months of data. Every engagement involving Iowa-class battleships. Every shell fired, every target hit. The numbers told a story. The 16-inch Mark 7 gun firing, Mark 8 armor-piercing shells had performed at or above specifications in every measurable category. Penetration tests using captured German and Japanese armour confirmed the pre-war calculations. 20 inches of Krupp cemented armour at 20,000 yards. More against some Japanese armour types, which used slightly different manufacturing processes. But the real story wasn't in the test data, it was in the combat reports. The engagement at Truk, where Iowa and New Jersey had achieved straddles at 35,000 yards. The shore bombardments at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and dozens of smaller islands. The psychological impact on enemy forces who discovered that no fortification was safe, no range was beyond reach. Thompson pulled out a folder marked Enemy Assessments Classified. Inside were interrogation reports from German and Japanese naval officers conducted in the months after surrender. The Germans had been remarkably candid. Kapitän zur See Hans Voss, former gunnery officer on the Tirpitz, had provided a 20-page technical analysis of American naval gunnery. His conclusion was stark. The Iowa class represented a generational leap in naval firepower that Germany could not match. Our 15-inch guns were adequate against British battleships. Against American 16-inch weapons firing 2,700-pound shells, our ships were obsolete. The armour protection we considered adequate provided no real defence. More revealing were the tactical assessments. Fregattenkapitän Werner Koch, who had served on the staff of Admiral Schneewind in Norway, described the standing orders issued in early 1944. All surface units were instructed to avoid engagement with Iowa-class battleships under any circumstances. The risk was considered unacceptable. Our capital ships, few as they were by that point, could not be sacrificed in battles we could not win. The psychological effect on crews was significant. We had built the Bismarck and Tirpitz as symbols of German naval power. Now we were being told they were inferior to American ships. It undermined what little confidence remained. The Japanese assessments were different in tone but similar in conclusion. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had survived the war despite commanding forces that faced Iowa-class battleships in the Philippines, wrote in his interrogation, "The American battleships possessed advantages in every category: superior fire control using radar, longer effective range, heavier shells, better armor schemes that concentrated protection where it mattered. Most significantly, they operated as part of carrier task forces, which meant they always had air superiority. Even if our battleships could have matched them gun to gun, which they could not, we would have been destroyed by aircraft long before reaching firing range." Thompson found the captured Japanese damage assessment reports particularly illuminating. After the war, Japanese engineers had examined the fortifications on Okinawa and other islands subjected to Iowa-class bombardment. Their reports described shell craters 30 feet deep in solid rock. Fortifications designed to withstand conventional bombardment had been obliterated. One report noted, "The American armor-piercing shells penetrated far deeper than we calculated possible. Our engineers based defences on British 14-inch and American 14-inch shell performance from earlier ships. The 16-inch shells with delayed fuses created entirely different damage patterns. Fortifications that should have survived were destroyed." But Thompson's most valued documents were the personal accounts, letters, diaries, and post-war interviews with the men who had served in Iowa-class turrets. Gunner's mate. First Class Robert Mackenzie, who Thompson had interviewed 3 months ago, had been remarkably articulate about the human side of operating these weapons. "You ask if I was proud of what we did," Mackenzie had said. "That's a complicated question. I was proud of my crew. We did our jobs professionally. We maintained those guns, loaded those shells, fired when ordered. Never had a misfire, never had an accident. In that sense, yes, I'm proud. But the guns themselves, the destruction they caused." Mackenzie had paused, choosing his words carefully. A single salvo from our turret represented more explosive power than entire Civil War battles. We could destroy in seconds what would have taken armies weeks to accomplish. I watched through a periscope once, saw what our shells did to a Japanese shore position. There was nothing left, not rubble, not ruins, nothing, just raw earth where there had been concrete bunkers. I knew there were men in those positions, some of them probably survived the bombardment, but I doubt many did. That's not something I'm proud of. It's something I carry. Thompson included Mackenzie's words in his report because the human cost mattered. The 16-inch Mark 7 gun was a triumph of engineering. The Mark 8 shell was a masterpiece of metallurgy and ballistics. Together, they represented the apex of battleship armament. But they were also instruments of death on a scale previous generations couldn't have imagined. The combat effectiveness came from the same source as the human tragedy, unprecedented destructive power delivered with precision at ranges that seemed impossible. The final section of Thompson's report addressed the strategic impact. The Iowa-class battleships had fundamentally altered naval warfare in ways that went beyond their actual combat record. Their mere existence had forced enemy navies to avoid engagement. German capital ships remained in port rather than risk confrontation. Japanese battleships, when they did sortie, did so with the knowledge that American battleships could appear with overwhelming force. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had proven that. When the Iowa-class battleships joined the carrier task forces in 1944, they created an armoured shield that no enemy surface force could penetrate. But more than that, they represented something deeper: American industrial capacity operating at full war production. The ability to build 6 of the most powerful battleships in the world, while simultaneously producing hundreds of other warships, tens of thousands of aircraft, millions of tons of vehicles and equipment. Each Iowa-class battleship required 2 million man-hours of labour. Each shell required 6 months to manufacture. The fact that America could sustain this level of production while fighting a 2-ocean war was perhaps more terrifying to enemies than the weapons themselves. Thompson closed his report with a section titled "Lessons for Future Naval Development." He knew that battleships were already obsolete. Aircraft carriers had proven their dominance. The atomic bomb, demonstrated so horrifically at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had rendered surface naval warfare almost quaint by comparison. But the lessons remained valid: precision engineering, quality control, the integration of complex systems into effective weapons. the training of crews to operate advanced equipment under combat conditions. These principles would apply to whatever came next. He signed the report and prepared it for submission. Someone, decades from now, might read these pages and wonder what it was like to witness the last great flowering of battleship technology, to see ships that could reach out 20 miles with shells that could punch through 2 feet of steel, to know that this represented both the pinnacle of a century of naval development and the end of an era. Thompson had been part of it, had calculated the trajectories, analysed the combat results, interviewed the men who made it work. He understood what had been achieved, and he understood why it would never be repeated. The age of the battleship was over, but for a few years from 1943 to 1945, the Iowa class had reigned supreme, unmatched, unbeatable. The final word in naval gunnery. Years later, during the 1980s, when Thompson was in his 70s, he received a letter from Germany. The writer identified himself as the son of a former Kriegsmarine officer who had served on the intelligence staff in Kiel during the war. His father had recently passed away, but among his papers was a report from late 1943 analysing American battleship capabilities. "My father kept this document his entire life," the letter read. "He told me it represented the moment he knew Germany had lost the war, not because of any single battle, but because the Americans had solved problems we didn't even know existed. He wanted me to tell you, if I ever had the chance, that the Iowa-class battleships were the finest warships he had ever studied. He said they represented everything his generation of German naval officers had aspired to build, but never achieved." Thompson wrote back, thanking him for the letter. He didn't mention his own role in analysing those same weapons, didn't talk about the reports he had written, just said that his father had been correct. The Iowa class represented something special, not just because of their guns or their armour or their speed, but because they embodied the full weight of American industrial power, focused on a single purpose, winning a war that had to be won. And in that purpose, they had succeeded absolutely. The Iowa-class battleships would serve again, decades later. They would bombard Lebanon in 1984, fire their guns in anger during the Gulf War in 1991. The same shells, the same guns, still capable of delivering devastating firepower across distances that seemed impossible. But they would never again face what they were designed to destroy: enemy battleships in surface combat. That era ended in 1945. The 2,700-pound armour-piercing shells that could penetrate 20 inches of armour at 20,000 yards never met their intended targets in battle. The German battleships stayed in port. The Japanese battleships were sunk by aircraft before Iowa-class guns could engage them. Perhaps that was the greatest tribute to their power. They were so effective that enemies chose not to fight rather than face them. The victory wasn't in the battles fought, it was in the battles that never happened, because no enemy commander was willing to sacrifice his ships and men against overwhelming odds. The Iowa class won by existing, by being so clearly superior that resistance seemed futile. In the end, that's what the 2,700-pound shell represented. Not just armour penetration and explosive force, but the absolute certainty that American industry, American engineering, and American determination would prevail. The Germans couldn't believe it at first, but belief, whether immediate or delayed, doesn't change mathematics. The shells could penetrate 20 inches of armour at 20,000 yards. They did it in tests. They would have done it in combat if given the chance. And in knowing that, in accepting that reality, the outcome of the naval war was already determined. The thunder had spoken, and the world had listened.